I'm going to hand it over to Nina Balk. She's the AIF director. She has a few words about AIF and its mission here at NC State.
Thank you, Jordan. So yeah, my name is Nina Balke. I'm the still relatively new director of AIF. I started last October and took over from Dr. Jacob Jones. And this is actually my my first workshop. So I'm very excited about it. I was very intrigued by the idea of having a combined workshop between AIF capability or characterization techniques and instruments we have, together with a company who provides cameras in like we see today for the Titan. So I think it's a really good synergistic effort, and it benefits everyone involved, and we can provide this workshop to all of you. Since I'm the new director of AIF, and some of you might not be familiar with the AIF, I want to spend a few words on it. And as you can see on the slide, and I'm going to read this off, the AIF is the largest shared facility at NC State. It's housed in the College of Engineering. And our AIF mission is to enable and lead state-of-the-art research through the acquisition, development, maintenance, training, and access to major analytical materials and biological characterization instrumentation. So that's a mouthful, right? So what it means in a little bit more detail here, some of our mission is enabled by building next generation infrastructure. In recent years, we have really invested a lot in biological and soft matter research, and also state-of-the-art computed tomography. So these are some of the newest capabilities we develop. And another big part of our mission is education and outreach. So we're providing workshops, short courses, open houses, tours. Anytime you're nearby, let us know. We can schedule a tour. And also, we provide by now a lot of online content due to the pandemic. So that's one of the silver linings. There's a lot of resources about AIF and the different techniques we have online. This here is my favorite slide because here we can brag about what all we have, right? So it's just written down, no images because the time didn't permit it. But you see we are very strong in microscopy. We have very varying SEMs. We have 2 focused ion beam microscopes, 3 TEMs. So one of them you see today. There's also 2 X-ray tomography microscopes. One is a micrometer scale, and the other one's nanometer scale. We have expertise in surface analysis, XPS, TOF-SIMS, Raman, diffraction. We have diffractometers. We can perform EBSD or the electron diffraction in the TEM. And then, as I mentioned, one of our core capabilities we're developing is for the biological community, where we have bio-EM sample prep, and we have different capabilities there, like a freeze fracture or high pressure freezer. I really want to introduce to you the staff at AIF because they are true experts in the characterization techniques we provide, and we are here to help you. This can have various shapes. We can either train you on a specific instrument. We can educate you about certain characterization techniques in form of short courses, or you can hand over your samples and we will do the measurements for you. If you need support in your research, just contact us. We're here to help. And with that, I think I want to let you get to what you came here to do, learn about TEM. And I'm looking forward to receiving feedback about this workshop, and also perhaps see some of the people online as future users of the AIF. Thank you.
Corey Zarnick, he is our product manager for imaging at Gatan, and he's going to be talking about 4K CMOS cameras for both Insitu and routine TEM studies. So Corey, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jordan. Yeah, so my name is Corey Zarnick. I'm located out in California, Pleasanton. And this is actually the first chance I've had to go visit customers since COVID. So thank you very much for the opportunity to come see the place and host this workshop, both in person and online as well. Just to reiterate, if you do have any questions, for those of you who checked in a little bit late, we will be fielding questions toward the end. And so if you do have anything along the way, feel free to type it in. We'll monitor it, and assuming we have time, we'll get to it at the end. And if you have any residual questions or something comes up afterwards, you can feel free to email us, and we can follow up with you separately as well. So here's a high-level outline of what I'll cover today. A little bit is starting with an introduction to cameras. So cameras are a fairly recent introduction to the world of transmission electron microscopy. And so this sort of puts things in perspective. And then I'll talk a little bit about, what are some of the requirements for cameras? What makes a good camera? What should you look for? What are the things that you need to consider? And then I'll go through just some of the camera basics, some of the fundamental ways we measure camera performance, some of the differences between cameras, and walk you through that a little bit. And then just very, very briefly, the intention, this isn't intended to be a product pitch by any stretch, but here's the portfolio of products that Gatan has today. And just to let you understand the difference between these, and you can compare and contrast, having gone through the camera basics, put it in perspective. And then a significant amount of time at the end talking about Insitu, which is what, is a large portion of what people do. You guys seem to have quite a nice setup here today. And so we'll go through that and some of the things we think are coming down the road in terms of capabilities or in terms of what researchers are going to be able to do. So we'll start with an introduction to cameras. And this was one of my first famous or infamous things that actually it's one of my only 2 YouTube videos. And you'll notice I'm wearing the same shirt today. For those of you here in the audience, thank you very much. And this is before TikTok. So I'll show you that I'm saving the video for later. Right, I got to build up to it. But some of you may have seen this. We used this for a while. So we didn't have TikTok. There's not a high production value in this. But the question is, I'm sitting there or standing there pushing on a column, and that's Prague in the background, by the way. Beautiful, beautiful place in case you have a chance to go. This is during a conference, and I'm standing there shaking the column. And so, what does that have to do with microscopy today? So a little bit of the history. I myself, actually, before I came to Gatan 12 years ago, thereabouts, I had never actually used a digital camera for electron microscopy. When I was at grad school at Los Alamos in Michigan, we used film. And so all of a sudden, I actually really appreciate the value of digital cameras compared to films in darkroom, and how many cassettes do you load and things. So I've seen both sides of it. CCDs came online pretty early. CCDs are great devices. They're used for astronomy, high signal noise. And starting in 1990, Gatan had the first real CCD camera. Before that, people used VCRs and things to record in situ videos, but they were really just pictures. They're just videos. So Gatan started getting data from the experiments. And in 2002 was the first direct detection camera. And I'll talk a little bit about direct detection later. And in 2008, 2009 was really when the CMOS cameras started to take off. So really about 12 years ago is when that transition started. CCDs are still around today. You can still get CCD cameras for TEM. And in a lot of respects, CCDs are very, very good. And I'll touch on some of the differences and some of the benefits, advantages of each. So this is what Insitu experiments looked like back in the 80s. So Dave Smith, fairly famous person. Some of you may have heard of him. ASU. And like I mentioned, this is done on a VCR. Hopefully everyone at least has seen a VCR or understands that technology. Not that old. But this is just a picture. Obviously it's not high quality, but the microscopes were good enough that you could see something atomic-y like, and you could see things change in a very coarse environment. And this was state of the art back in the time, but you still didn't have data. You just had pictures. And so really kind of limited what you could do. So when we talk about high performance cameras today, it's always an interesting question. What do you think of, if I said high performance camera, what does that mean? It can mean anything, like high performance car, what does high performance mean? So it could be you have really fast frame rates, right? High performance, high temporal resolution, that could be. It could be high quality images. But how do you quantify high quality images? What does that mean? Right? Are you looking for who knows what? Are there particular features or applications, right? Is there something you want to do with the sensor, something you want to do with the camera that would make it high performance for what you're trying to do? So just really briefly, those of you online, I apologize. You won't be eligible for the cash and prizes we'll give away here for people in person. But just for the people here, like what do you think makes, if you're going to pick a camera or a detector or a sensor, what characteristics do you think you'd want in them? Just shout it out if you got it.
I've got a laundry list.
Okay, shoot.
Resistance, radiation damage, so you don't need.
Okay, radiation damage.
High refresh rate.
Okay, so frame rate.
Range,
High dynamic range.
very low background from noise.
Okay. Okay, so let's clearly you called my bluff. You're right. You do have a laundry list, so congratulations. But like just anything. I mean, most of your guesses are probably going to be correct because you all have some notion of what you expect cameras to do. So like what else would you want? The pixel size. Okay. Oh, the resolution. Okay. Yeah, I mean resolution. If you can't see anything with your camera, then it's not a very good camera. It doesn't matter how many pixels you have. So yeah, that's very true. What else?
I think the software also matters. A lot of people they don't know how to use the camera. So if there's a camera which is good, it has to be, easier to use.
So right. So software, ease of use, because you don't actually care about using the camera. You care about the features, how easy it is to use, but you're trying to get to a result at the end of the day. Yeah, no, that's very true. Go on. There's got to be two more things out there.
Cost and lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. So, how much does it cost, right? Not everyone's got $10 million to spend on a camera these days, right? But everyone has a camera. I assume everyone looks like everyone maybe has a phone. So most phone, it's like, so everyone understands the basics of taking a picture, right? What are the things you have to control? And so the way we think of it is there's no single answer, right? I mean, you have a laundry list, but it's like you're trying to do all these different things, and it's like the best camera for one person who is taking, I just used cars. So, the car is stationary, I control the lighting, I can control the angle of the car, the information, I know exactly what I want. And so I really just need to take a gorgeous picture. That's one camera. Another one might be, I want to do all that, but I also want to do like close-ups, and I want noise-free images, right? I want it to be very smooth, I don't want it grainy, and so I need to do close-ups and I need to do some telephoto or longer distance shots. A third one might be I need to do all that, but I also need to take pictures of fast-moving cars from a long ways away, to say fly down the freeway, and I still want to find detail, and I can't control the environment, so I can't control the lighting, and it might be nighttime shots. So I need a camera that really does everything, right? Three very different things. No single camera, right? That last camera is probably going to be a big, expensive camera, big, fancy, expensive camera. Same thing with SLRs today, right? You see these photographers at the Olympics, and they've got like, lenses that are 2 feet long. So the important thing is to understand how the camera is going to be used. Some cameras are really good at one thing, but coming up with a camera that really covers a wide range of things is pretty hard to do, even with the advances in technology today. So this is what we're faced with at Gatan. So just some general guidelines. High performance cameras should have, and we touched on some of these, frame rates that give you the full entitlement, not just of the equipment, but of what you're trying to do. So if you're trying to do drift correction, if you're just doing search and alignment on the TEM, you want a fast response rate so that you can do this in real time and you don't have to change modes and make it easy for the person. You want the highest resolution, to the point on resolution for general imaging. You want functionality for specific applications, so that could be software, right? So, help me analyze my 4D STEM, or, help me figure out what low dose images look like. And easy to use interface, again, to software, right? And as we go through this, you'll see that the software becomes an increasingly important part of having this. And we'll touch on that as well. So the trick is to combine all of this in a single platform without too much trade-off, right? We at Gatan, and everyone who makes cameras, it's not just Gatan, we're all making trade-offs, right? We could make it the camera does everything, but no one would be able to afford it. No one would use it. And it would probably be too complicated to use. And so how do we create definitions of cameras and products that are well suited for the widest, widest audience? Just some key terms, because you may hear them a lot, or we may talk about them. I'm not going to go through examples and rigorous definitions of each, but resolution is the ability to distinguish contrast, most simply, right? So it's a combination of looking at contrast and looking at sharpness is MTF. And so how do you distinguish, signal? Sensitivity, how much input signal produces an output signal, right? So a very sensitive camera, you might have a single electron and you get a lot of signal. There are pros with that. There are cons with that, right? It's like, where do you want to put that? Where do you want to put that target, that goal? Point spread function, if you have a single electron, an electron only hits in a single place. But what happens, as you see, is it creates a cloud of signal, and the distribution of that cloud tells you how broad it is. And ideally, it's pretty small, but it gets more complicated than that. It's not as simple as the smallest point spread function is always the best for every camera. Dynamic range came up. So this is the range in signal levels that you can detect, the discrete levels. It's a combination of several things. How much noise do you have? Sort of tells you what the bottom level is, the size of the full well, how much accumulation you can do, gives you the upper end. And DQE. So we'll talk about DQE. I could spend 30 minutes talking about DQE. I'm not going to spend 30 minutes talking about DQE. If you have questions about DQE, be happy to talk about it afterwards. But just very simply, this is a good measure of the output of the signal to noise ratio of a sensor. So the highest DQE you can get is one that would be a perfect detector. The signal noise ratio that came into that camera would be the exact same as going out. So that's a perfect camera. And that can't be done. We can come close with counting and direct detection, but we can't hit 1. So some characteristics when you're comparing cameras, you need to think about field of view. There's, again, just a trade-off. Neither location is necessarily better. It depends on what you're doing. The size of your pixels goes to the resolution to a certain degree. Frame rate, if you're doing in situ, how fast, what temporal resolution do you want? Sensitivity versus resolution. Are you trying to maximize the signal, or are you trying to get the most resolution, right? If you just generating a ton of signal might spread out over a very large area, then you kind of lose the resolution. You're not sure exactly where that electron hit, right? So but maybe you just need all the signals. Like, I don't care so much about the resolution. I just need all the signal I can get. That's one of the differences between counting and scintillator-based cameras. STEM diffraction. With these cameras, several years ago, we came out with 4D STEM. And there's a lot of advantages in using pixelated diffraction cameras and pixelated STEM detectors. There's lots of neat analysis you can do, particularly if you store all the data at very high speeds. So people see a lot of advantages in that. Anna and Fernando will touch on that this afternoon. Binning, do you use binning? There are advantages to binning. You can improve the signal. In most cases, you can improve the speed. Do you need it? Do you not need it? Sometimes you want to do it just to reduce the data quantity. And then notice we keep coming back to software. So it has to be easy to use, easy to set up, easy to acquire, and easy to analyze. And the last one, this one's a little bit weird. If you don't have a GIF, it's not a question. But if you do have a GIF, obviously, if you have anything above the GIF, you have to be able to move it out of the way. So Gatan typically has all retractable because we sell GIFs, and not everyone. That's not necessarily true for everyone else. One slide on direct detection. So what's the difference? Some of you may be familiar with this. The traditional fiber coupled camera, and this is CCD or CMOS. There's a scintillator, you transfer, so it generates the light, you transfer the light, you collect the light, and in terms of DQE, if you can see here, so an electron hits in the middle here and generates this cloud of electrons, or a cloud of light. Well, actually, these are the electron traces. This is a Monte Carlo simulation of, I don't know, 10,000 points or 1,000 electron traces. And you can see that some of the electrons just go into the fiber, which is fine, that those don't generate signal. Some of the electrons come back up into the scintillator and you generate signal over here. So even though the electron hit here, you're generating signal over here, which is actually noise, right? Your electron only hits one place, but because of all the traces, and so this is one of the limitations. This is why typically scintillator-based and lens-coupled cameras have a lower DQE than direct detection. And then there's all these other factors on the right. The difference with the direct detection is you eliminate a lot of you eliminate the fiber, you eliminate the scintillator, you eliminate distortions in the lens or the fiber, and you have much less scatter. So these are very, very thin. They're back thin sensors. And so the electrons fly through. The electrons fly through, and there's much, much less interaction with the silicon underneath. So you do get some signal here. But for the most part, this is your point spread function down here, as opposed to the distribution of light generation in this one. So this is one of the reasons why direct detection cameras typically have smaller pixels, because you want to match the point spread function to the pixel size, right? Then you get a one-to-one lineup of those. Electron counting. So what's the effect of this? This first slide, this is what you would get if you just kept turning down your beam. You get sort of a starry night. The problem with this is twofold. One is that if you see, this might be a single electron hit that kind of went sideways. And then any one of these individual dots may be a single electron hit. Both of those electrons actually have the same amount of information. The problem is if you just accumulate the total signal, you have this distribution. Some electrons are weighted more than other electrons, which isn't right. You know, all electrons are equal. We don't discriminate. All electrons are equal. That sounds so timely. So that's one problem. The other problem is if you look at the background, it's kind of gray, right? Because there's read noise, there's other, someone mentioned thermal noise, and that all is treated as signal per se. So if we count, then we have zeros and we have ones. And every pixel is either a 0 or it's a 1. So we can wipe out the gray in the background. So we eliminate the read noise and all of what we call Landau noise, which is the deposited energy distribution as a function of electrons. Those all collapse to a 1. So we have ones and zeros, and all the electrons are treated the same. So that takes the DQE maybe from 10% at half Nyquist to like 50, 60, 70, 80%. And so it's this huge advantage, which is why direct detection is taken off for the highest signal to noise. One interesting thing, I like putting things in historical perspective a little bit. If you go back to the first Gatan camera, I mentioned that was 1990. That was a slow scan. What you see here is a function of time on the x-axis, and what is the output pixel speed of the camera that Gatan produced at that point. So back in the 90s, we were less than 1 megapixel a second, which today seems somewhat laughable, right? You have a 16 megapixel camera, that's just a non-starter. These were state of the art when I joined, the Erlangchen, Ultrascan, and Arias. They're all kind of similar. CCD technology, the PC technology was the same there. So these are all pretty close. And all of a sudden with direct detection, and those of you familiar with K2IS was really the first one, we went up by orders of magnitude, which is a huge challenge. It's not just about the sensor, it's about how do you handle the data, how do you store the data, how do you analyze the data, multiple challenges. And you see here with the K3, sorry, my mouse is somewhere. There we go. With K3, this is the output of the camera. So the camera actually generates more data, right? 10 times more data than the K2. But that was one of the learnings from K2. We said we can't just, like, if we chase that top curve, we're dead. Like, nobody's going to want to play with that camera. So we start doing more inline processing. And so what we store is actually less data. I mean, it's less megabytes, but it's based on more information out of the camera. So we figured out ways to sort of get off that curve, which is good. That helps you, it helps us, it helps science. And the technologies like 10 gig E, SFP+, InfiniBand, solid state drives, NVMe drives, these all have come down to affordable levels. And so they're really kind of off the shelf systems today. In fact, most of the analysis, most of you can do with laptops or entry-level desktops, I guess. Okay, now the moment you've all been waiting for. I need some help. I haven't looked at this video for years, and last time I checked, I think I had like 130 views, and I really want to be an influencer. And the problem, okay, I have multiple problems with that. One of them is that TikTok wasn't around when we made this in Prague 8 years ago. So, but this is an experiment that we did. Let's see, oops, let me put those here. So there I am. Yeah, okay, it's laughable by today's, and I'm not doing a little clever dance that people can mimic. Maybe I should have thought about that. But this is one of the simple things we showed early with the one view camera, is we can do real-time drift correction. And actually, just fun fact, Anna's going to be speaking this afternoon. She's the one who's actually driving the microscope here. So she's doing all the clicks and everything seems nice and tight and seamless. So if you have time, if you care to help, let me know how to improve my YouTube, followers. I don't even know what they're called anymore.
Tell us to hit that like and subscribe button.
I didn't say that. I didn't say that. But maybe you have friends, or maybe you know people who are influencers, and they can give me some pointers. No, but it's a good, clever, easy way to show it. And it sticks with people. Like, it's very visceral. Like, what are you doing? The Joel engineers got very upset with me that day, by the way. I would suggest you don't walk up to their column and start pushing it when they're there. So just a point. Okay, camera basics. I've already touched on a lot of this, but just to give a little more detail, there are 4 basic components in scintillator. We talked about the scintillator, or scintillator-based camera. There's scintillator, so you have to decide, do you want higher sensitivity or higher resolution? So you created light, you have to transfer the light. That can be lens coupled. There are lots of lens coupled cameras out there. Or it could be fibers, and you have to decide what kind of fiber and what's your fiber pitch size. How large fibers do you want in the bundle? How many fibers do you want in the bundle? How thick do you want it? How much does that cost? Lots of detail there. Most people think of just a sensor. They think of camera and they think, oh, what's the frame rate? How many pixels? And they only think about the sensor. And that's okay. The sensor is usually very unique. But the point is, there's all this other stuff, all these other decisions that the company has to make and trade-offs. So not that you're expert, not that we ask you, oh, which fiber would you like? But just being aware of it, I think, puts things in perspective. So, and then readout. So the sensor can get the data, but then you have to get the data out. What do you do with the data? How do you store the data? How do you analyze the data? That's a whole separate challenge. With direct detection, it seems much more straightforward. So there's no light involved at all. So we don't have distortions or noise coming from light. So therefore, we don't have to transfer the light. So there's no noise or distortion there. And you don't really have a choice of technology. CCDs actually can do direct detection. The problem is they damage to the radiation hardness point. You lose it in a day. And the the K2, K3 cameras we have today last for years under some pretty intense. And so that was really the major challenge to overcome. That's some pretty tricky pixel design. And then what do we do with this? Frame rates are always getting faster. We're putting more pixels into cameras. The title of the talk's 4K by 4K, but we're actually moved past that with K3 today. So just different challenges. So we support both. It's not saying direct detection is necessarily better than scintillators. To the point I made at the top, it depends on what you want to do with it. It depends on your budget. It depends on the type of user. It depends on what information you're trying to get. So that's why I think it's helpful to understand some of the basics of camera design and what some of the trade-offs are. CCD versus CMOS, I think there aren't a lot of new CCD cameras coming on the market, but most people have a CCD camera. And so if you're thinking about what's the difference between, like if I upgrade from a CCD to a CMOS, what's the difference? The difference is really that in CCDs, you're doing charge transfer. And so you're physically moving the charge in each pixel in a bucket brigade style, and you move it down to here, and then you're reading it out. And here is where it converts to a voltage that you read out. With the CMOS, some of you may know, each pixel has its own conversion. And so it collects charge, the pixel creates a voltage, and so the entire system is just reading voltages. So it can be much faster, you can have many more ports. So the CMOS cameras today, we read out 8, 16, 32 ports out the top and the bottom, which gives us a frame rate. That's one of the main reasons why CCD cameras typically are slower than CMOS. And depending on how many transistors, I should be careful. I'm at a university. I shouldn't say I could give a course on this because, careful what you wish for. Yeah, so it's really just about optimizing the trade-offs. So what can cameras do? Going back 15 years, it was really just about imaging and diffraction. And that was it. And diffraction for a while was in vogue and then kind of fell out of vogue, and now it looks like it might be coming back. But today's cameras can do a lot more. We can do high speed or continuous tomography. We can do in situ, I'll touch on. And it really has opened the window for a lot of 4D STEM. And this has really taken off in the last 3-4 years. And you'll see an example of that with Fernando on the Titan later this afternoon. And I'll speak to it. And this is all done with the camera. Every microscope needs a camera, right? So one of our thoughts is, well, if you have to get a camera anyway, why not do lots of neat things with it? So that's just our approach in general. So the products, I'll just go through this quickly. Again, it's not to focus on the products, but just explain the differences. So 3View is a large pixel, 15 micron pixel camera, 25 frames a second, 4K by 4K. This camera's actually been in the marketplace for 7 years. That's the one we were demonstrating when I was pushing on the column, was a 1View. So this is the first camera on the market that had a true in situ. We captured data, we had drift correction, we had look back, really kind of, I think, redefined what and how people do in situ experiments. You don't need to bin to hit high frame rates. And this coincided with the release of DM 3.0. So if you're using something, digital micrograph, in the recent history, if you have workspaces, then you have GMS3. If you don't have workspaces and the techniques, then you're using something older, and you should think about some of the advantages of going up to DM3. Drift correction, you saw it in the video, lots of sources. All the Gatan cameras today come with drift correction. Doesn't matter if it's in situ or not. We think that that's a fundamental characteristic that all cameras need to be able to deliver, because drift can come from lots of different sources. And it's done, you can do it real time, you can do it in post-processing. And there are trade-offs between each of those. With drift correction on, drift correction off. This is some early work looking at beam sensitive materials. So two things to note here. One is you can sort of see the zeolite crisping up under the electron beam. The second thing is the timer in the upper right. You can see that there's actually very small time increments. And so you're getting really good temporal resolution in this sample. And you can actually quantify how this damages. You can look at the FFT and you can see how the structure disappears. There's a lot of neat things you can do. Diffraction, I mentioned we can do. Anna's going to touch on this afternoon, but you can get beautiful, beautiful diffraction patterns. With the 4K by 4K, one of the advantages here is we can collect an in situ video and you have a large field of view. And if you have something like sintering gold nanoparticles, you aren't sure what the dynamics are going to be. You aren't sure which ones are going to get together. And I've sat there for 12 minutes watching gold come together and then they kind of drift apart. They come together, they drift apart. It's infuriating. But if you collect a large field of view, then what you can do is you can say, well, I really only care about this one and I really only care about this time. So you can go back and crop this and you still have a lot of pixels, so you can still see detail, right? And you have good temporal resolution. And you can go even further. And so now you can crop even further if you want to. And this is still unbinned, and you can actually see the time where the particle, and then you get the realignment of the grains, and you can look at, there's a lot of neat information, right? So they do this with Syria. They do this with gold. Just simple examples, but a good way to demonstrate the power of what these cameras can do today. Rio, very similar in a lot of respects to OneView. Smaller pixels, so doesn't quite have the full field of view or the DQE, but has a lot of the same attributes. While there's only one flavor of OneView, there's 3 flavors of Rio. I'm not going to take you through all of it. The in situ one is the Rio 16. So this one, for in situ, this is the one that you would get. This one shows the power of 35 millimeters. So for those of you who have it, you appreciate this, but the purple, this purple dashed part, which is somewhere, well, you see the purple dash. That's the Rio 16 in the side mount camera, 35 millimeter port. If you put it in the bottom, it collapses to the small solid purple. So huge difference in the field. So it really depends on what you want to see. No location, and there's trade-offs. If you're doing high mag, typically you want the bottom, you get the additional mag factor. If you're doing pathology or large field of view, typically you might want side mount. So, and the Rio cameras will fit in either. Also has drift correction. This is just another way to show it. Drift correction on, drift correction off, because the Rio runs at 20 frames a second, which is plenty fast to do this kind of drift correction. And you can see it in the FFTs. Very nice imaging for materials science, gallium arsenide, nice examples for life science, all different pathology samples. And so, again, you think about the applications, and we had to figure out how to design one camera that was good for high contrast, low contrast, and in situ, and just sort of fixed stained and unstained samples, for example. All right, now on to the main topic, in situ. So at Gatan, we've developed, sometimes we think of it as an ecosystem, because there's a lot of data collection techniques that we have, and you have to worry about processing the data and analyzing the data. So the simplest thing is most people start with this imaging. I want a picture, or I want tomography, right? And so, sure, we can do that in situ. We can do in situ imaging. What about diffraction? Well, we can do that too. And we have applications we'll describe for 4D STEM. And with the 4D STEM, you can do strain mapping, you can do DPC, you can, we have micro ED, you can do virtual apertures, grain orientation. So that's a very powerful tool. We have analytical. So you can do EELs, in situ FTEM, in situ EDS. And these are all disparate techniques, right? They're all individual techniques. One of the challenges we have is to try to put them together so they can talk to each other. Like I want to do an EELS EDS experiment, or I want to take images at the same time I'm doing something else, or on the same sample, or I have a holder, and so I want to, look at it as a function of temperature, or, like different flow rates of gases, for example. Cooling, straining, third-party holders, right? Gatan doesn't do MEMS, but we work with the MEMS manufacturers, and we share information with them just to try to make things, because otherwise you're dealing with, like I said, disparate systems, and you got some data located over here and some data located over here, and that can get hard to juggle. And tying it all together, is digital micrograph. So DM really underpins all of these techniques, but it's not enough to just capture the data, right? So we give customers the opportunity to look at the data with the Insitu player, to manipulate the data, manipulate in a good way, not an evil, snarky way. Python scripting's big, holder integration. All that is doable today in digital micrograph. And the Insitu applies to all these different products that we have. Could be Rio, OneView, K3, Stella, Continuum GIF. We have Stella GIF, we have K3 GIF, EDS, right? So Gatan's unique in many respects. One of them is we have this diversity of techniques. And so one of our challenges is how do we, to the point of making it simple, how do we make this just really easy for customers to get a result? So that's one of the big challenges we're working on today. In terms of holders, heating, cooling, mechanical strain, most of you should be familiar with at least one or two of those. And I mentioned the third-party capabilities. They have some very nice, liquid cell holders, very nice gas holders, biasing holders, combination of those techniques. And we don't think that Gatan needs to be the everything to everybody, but we, in terms of like what's best for the end user, we want to make it easiest, whether that's in the DM environment or something else, just like making sure you have access to the right data and the right integration at the right time. Today in DM, what you'll see in the demo that we're doing, without stealing too much of Fernando's thunder, this is the current layout in GMS3. So if you don't see something like this, like I said, you'll maybe want to at least understand the differences. But the layout's very simple. So you have the TM information on the left, workspace in the middle, and all of your processing tools and workflow on the right. And I'll let Fernando step through it, but the layout's very straightforward, very intuitive, but the tools are extremely powerful, right? We spend a lot of time taking really complicated things and trying to present them to the user very simply. And you can see that here with data collection. So if we look at this, this entire sea of hexagons, it's pretty intimidating. So if you want to do an in situ experiment, it can be as easy as you just change between normal and in situ mode, and you set up your camera, whatever you want, binning modes and exposure time, how much look back you want. And then you say where you want to store the data. Choose your holder. For example, heating holder, you might say, give me a ramp to something over some time and hold, and then you hit start. And the system just goes, runs off, collects it all, lines it all, and it's off to the races. Look back, you may not know where things happen in the field of view or in time. And so with look back, you can let something happen. If you have a 10-second look back, you can see something happen and then wait 8 seconds and then hit record, and there's actually a buffer. So you never miss, which when we released this for in situ microscopists, they were blown away. It's like, oh my gosh, do you know how much I've missed over the years because I'd see something but I hadn't started recording. So this actually made a very big difference. And then because it's a large format camera, you can still get the detailed information you have when you pull it out. The in situ data, you'll note two things here, the timestamp in the bottom. So this is 1 second of data collection, and it's 270 electrons per angstrom squared. which is not much signal. And yet you can pretty clearly see what's happening in your sample. And this is just, we have tens and hundreds of these videos. This is sort of what people do day in and day out with direct detection low dose cameras. And the dose rate's always synchronized. And so you don't have to go back after the fact and try to do calculations. It's all right there. Here's an example of coordinating with holder data. So this is an EELS experiment. It's not just cameras, even though we have a lot of details on cameras. So you can look at low loss, you can look at high loss. And on the bottom, you see a temperature profile. And you can curve fit this, and you can look to see as we ramp up and ramp down the temperature of this, you can see the curve shift in the EELS plot. All right, so I'll play this hopefully. There we go. Right, so simple example, and it's done a couple times, so you can see where it is with respect to the red dotted line. Simple experiment, but gives you an idea of what you could do with this. You can do much, much more complicated things. And this is all saved as a single data set. And so when you open this, you can actually drag that time bar to wherever you want, and you get that EELS spectra shown in the top. So it's all synchronized, as opposed to having to go back and do some crazy Excel or lining up data. So again, trying to make it easy. And finally, processing and analysis. You may have an experiment that runs for a long time, like this one's actually running. So your sample may move, we change focus. There's a lot going on here, we move it back. We don't actually care at the end of the day about this whole thing. There's a lot we just don't need. So we give you the tools. When I said manipulate, this is what I was referring to. You can turn it into presentation ready results. So in DM, you can do things like crop the field of view, you can change the duration, correct for drift, add scale bars, timestamps, and you can create MP videos of this. So you're not always running in and you can ship it to your friends with there'll be small data sizes. So on the right, you see the same video, but your particle is not moving all over the field of view, and you only keep the time that you're interested in. And the tools that we have a player that lets you just see the data. We have an editor that lets you do all the things I talked about. So you can crop in time and space. You can combine frames to improve signal and noise. You can do drift correction with or without filtering. You can track particles. You can export the data. All of this is in this Insitu editor, palette. And this is a free download at gatan.com. If you go to the support software section, right? So we want to make sure everyone has the tools. So if one person collects a set of data, they share it with their colleague, don't worry about the licenses. Everyone can look at the data. Everyone can go through and scrub it and use the editor and look at it. So, and that's actually one of the most popular parts of our website is a software download for some reason. Free software, who doesn't like free software? So take advantage of that. And if you have comments or feedback, how we can improve it, we're always open to suggestions. And lastly, scripting, just to mention for scripting, back in the day, we only had DM scripting, which, many people knew how to do. You could do some very powerful things. But now with Python, you can use NumPy. There's just whole suites of libraries. And I would imagine much of the audience today is familiar with this and has probably done some Python coding themselves. And so this is how you can right? We have a general workflow. This is how you customize the workflow and the analysis for your experiment, right? I want to do something specific, like I want to do radial summing of FFTs. And so that's what this script is showing, this Python script. So the time, you see the time growing on the sort of the x-axis. In the radio profile, you can see when the melting happens and when the quenching happens, just based on that script output. And you can get this in real time. You can get this in post-processing. So we think that it's an extremely valuable tool. Image segmentation. I mean, there's a whole. Again, we could give a course on this, but we're not doing that here today. And that's it. So, we have a lot of tools. We're trying to enable people to do it. We have some ideas, and this is what's available today. So if you have questions about it, Fernando's going to show you some of it. Obviously, there's not time to show you all of it, but we'd be happy to either take any questions or we can just move on to the next session. All right, thank you. Oh, sorry. After the clap. Yeah, and we have a lot of YouTube videos. And so I'll leave this up here for a couple minutes. We'll email this out to registrants as well. And so these are actually really good tools. We put some significant time to this to explain, you know, what are the, like I didn't go over the details, but if you want to know what the details are, you can go here. If you want to learn about, you know, Insitu TDM or Insitu TEM or 4D STEM, you know, we have channels with tens and tens and tens of videos. So yeah, play around, please. All right, Jordan.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so one of the questions was, are all cameras compatible with all microscopes?
I would say bottom mount cameras generally are compatible with just about all microscopes. The only real consideration is, like I mentioned, the GIF on the bottom. That restricts the height, and so that limits which cameras. Combining cameras from different companies, like sometimes we have a camera that's mounted opposite a competitor's camera. We do it. It's just we got to make sure we have all the right parts, and then it's safe, like X-ray safety. 35mm port's a little bit trickier because the microscope manufacturers do different things. Sometimes it's a rectangular port, which is the most common, and we can do most of those. Sometimes it's a very small round port, and the camera simply won't fit, like it was designed for something else. So the side mount varies. The bottom mount in general is at least possible, if not easy, I'd say.
So you mentioned data during the presentation. What do you find are successful strategies for managing like large data sets and data transfer and data storage?
Yeah, so we provide enough storage locally that you can store data on the disk. But what we provide, obviously at some point you're going to fill it up. So what we provide is not a long-term strategy. We never say it's a long-term strategy. But you can collect a day, a couple days worth of data, and then it has to go somewhere. So that's one option. And it really is site dependent. Some people have 10 gig lines networked all over the building, and it's very easy, right? Some don't. And so they get USB drives and they put in spinning disks and they run around the building with them, and that works. What we've done recently is we've tested, you can put Mellanox cards into the PC. And we've tested even with a K3 IS PC, and we don't usually do this just because of the setup in our building, but you don't even need to store the data on that PC anymore. You can throw the data to a remote location. So the experiment we did was we said, okay, you know, where I said data path, instead of saving it to the C drive or the, you know, like a local drive on that PC, we put a virtual drive in, and we just sent it out over InfiniBand, over 100 gig connection, and we stored it on another PC that was, you know, on the other side of the building. So you never store it locally; it's always stored in the final location. And as you store the data, one of my colleagues, Ben Miller, presented at M&M. He attached PCs to the storage location, so that as it stores data, you can have PCs with DMs start interrogating the data, and it can provide near real-time results back to the person sitting at the microscope. So like the radial FFTs, you know, it can be sending the data downstairs or wherever your big server rooms are. If there's a PC sitting there, as the data comes in, it can look at it and be like, okay, here's a radio profile, send it back to the user at the microscope. And so that person knows, oh, it's a good data set, it's not a good data set, it's the wrong part of the sample, microscope's not set up right, something like that. So we think long-term that's going to be the best solution. And it's just the infrastructure has to catch up with that, because just like I said in the data rate slide, just keeping on that top curve is just not sustainable in the long run. So we have to do something else.
Okay. So one more question. Does the camera performance change after the energy filter? You mentioned that sometimes microscopes have that.
Yeah, so we can improve. We won't be able to show you examples of that today because we don't have the setup behind a GIF. But doing the energy filtering, we can get a lot of the zero loss signal out. And so you really can focus on the signal you're interested in. The best example of this is with structural biologists. They found a lot of benefit because they have low contrast samples. And they found that putting a K3, well, a K2 or a K3 at the end of a GIF, they could get more information out of the sample and they could get better reconstruction resolution for their samples. And that's true of eels, it's true of imaging, it's true of a lot of things. So GIFs generally improve your life is maybe the simple, even though they're large and somewhat expensive, but they're fantastic pieces of equipment. Like you can do amazing things with these cameras. So.
Okay, we have one more question online, and then if anyone here wants to ask questions, we've got time for that too. Could you please explain how direct detection cameras can be used for beam sensitive materials compared to CCDs?
Compared to CCDs, okay. Yeah, so CCD has, I mean, first and foremost, it has read noise. And so that by itself, you know, eliminating the two advantages again of direct detection is you eliminate all the noise you can. So you want ideally a noise-free environment. And CCDs, there's always noise. They're highly efficient at the charge transfer. They're like 6 nines or 8 nines efficient, but there's always some loss and there's always some noise. And you're still, you know, there's thermal effects and, you know, you can't really count. And the amount of energy that's deposited per electron. Remember that starry night, and I said, well, there's an electron, and this one's this big, and this one's this big. So it suffers from that. With the counting, we can get so much more signal out of a we can get the same signal out of maybe 1/10 of the dose because the DQ is higher. So if the DQ is 60% and your CCD is 6%, we can use, you know, much less signal, 10 times less signal to get the same signal to noise, which is sort of the quasi-mathematical answer to the question. It really centers around DQE. And, but like I said, it doesn't make the CCD a bad camera and the direct detection a good camera. It depends on what you want to do with it. If you want to do low dose, then yeah, I strongly suggest, you know, and not just Gatan cameras or competitors' cameras, but direct detection cameras will outperform for low dose. So.
Great. So is there any questions in the audience here? Question in the back.
Yes, in the back.
So I know direct electron detectors, cameras, primarily used in the dose stock, biological reproductions, or things that were higher electron doses would destroy the sample in moths and lights. Can you use them for material science applications, very high doses?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. The what? Oh, yeah, sorry. So the question is, direct detection cameras are very good for low dose samples. Essentially, what about material science type applications or things that are higher dose, I guess, is the question. Yeah, so direct detection cameras first were introduced to serve that low dose beam sensitive market. And it was structural biology. But guess what? There's a lot of others, you know, beam sensitive materials out there for material science. So one answer to that question is yes, right? There's a lot of material science, and now they're looking at cryo techniques, and they're looking at, you know, beam sensitive materials. Semiconductors are becoming beam sensitive. You know, it's not just polymers. It could be, you know, catalyst. It's the world is becoming a more sensitive place. But the camera itself is not limited to just doing low dose, right? We can do diffraction, we can do seabed with these, which I wouldn't consider a traditional low dose applications. The sensor itself will do fine, right? It's actually kind of hard to damage the K2, K3 sensors, so it'll read it out. The question is if you throw, and it's a very fast camera, If we're infinitely fast, you could throw an infinite beam dose at it. So the only limitation is the frame rate of the camera. And so at 1500 electrons, if you say you want to do 20 or 30 or 40 electrons per pixel per second, that kind of, and you can go above that and you'll get a picture. It's just your DQE starts falling off because you'll have multiple electrons hit adjacent. You'll have 2 electrons and you'll count them as a single electron. And so that's where your signal starts falling off. But it'll work. You won't damage the sensor. And like I said, for diffraction and those kinds of things, people are using it a lot today. Like I would say 4D STEM is an extremely popular application. So that's good.
Okay, all right. So it looks like that's all the questions. Thank you. Yeah, thank you again, Corey. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next part of the workshop. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to hand it over to Fernando, who is down at the Titan, and he will be able to show you the next component of this with a live OneView demo. So give us 1 second while we switch presenters.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Fernando Castro. I'm the imaging application scientist here for Gatan, and I am downstairs. If you're in person, I'm 4 floors down in the basement in the room for the aberration-corrected FEI Titan microscope that we're going to be using today for the demo with our OneView camera. So the Titan is a 300 kV microscope, aberration corrected. As I already said, we have our OneView IS camera, and I'm going to walk through everything here on digital micrograph that Corey touched on within his presentation. So digital micrograph is a really, really powerful tool for easily starting to capture data, imaging data, doing analysis on that stuff, and then taking it to the next level also with doing in situ experiments. So this is digital micrograph version 3, as Corey was explaining in his presentation. So we'll just dive right into it. And if you have any questions, please submit them as you've been doing so, and we'll get towards them at the end. So in digital micrograph 3, here there's 3 main sections of the essentially software window. On this left-hand side, we'll have everything related to the microscope and the Gatan hardware that we're using. On the right-hand side here, we'll have where we select all the types of either data collection or data processing workflows. And in this middle region here is where we'll have our workspace to start collecting and looking at all of our data. So one of the first things I'm going to touch on right now is the microscope system panel and display. It's a super easy way of quickly controlling what you need to on the microscope to get going on the camera or any other Gatan hardware that you have. So it gives you information about what accelerating voltage we're at. We're at 300 kV. Right now the microscope is in TEM mode or imaging mode, and we're at a certain a high mag to look at the sample that we'll be looking at. So we have the column valves closed on the microscope, for example. So let's open them up, right? It's really easy to get going. We just click this button here and we'll see this microscope diagram start to update once everything's ready. So the valve is opened up. We see this blue line coming down here. We actually have a beam blanker on that we can control also through the software. Now we have our beam coming through, hitting our sample, and it's actually stopping on the fluorescent screen. So if you're here with me, you could see the beam on the screen. Right now, there's actually no one in the room with me, so let's just view it on the camera. So we can actually also lift the viewing screen here directly from the software, and our camera is not inserted, so we'll click on that, and we'll insert the camera. You may be able to hear this sort of hissing sound. That's the air coming through into the camera to get it inserted into the microscope. It'll just take a few seconds, and I can hear it's done. The other thing I will touch here on the side here is, there's each little sub window here is what we refer to in Gatan as a palette. So within this camera monitor palette, it gives you some information on what the temperature of the camera is, which needs to be slightly cooled to get the best performance out of the sensor. Everything is happy with the camera. It tells you the health status is green. And we have some nice, utility here also for stage trackers. You can actually load and save stage positions on your microscope very easily, and I'll come back to this a little later. So now that we have everything inserted, we have the beam on the camera. We'll go over here to the right-hand side where we see the technique manager. Based on what kind of hardware you may have on your microscope, you'll have different types of techniques here. So today we'll be talking about imaging and in situ right now, and then later in the afternoon we'll talk about STEM imaging and 4D STEM data acquisition. So we want to do TM imaging. So it's very easy. We just click here into the TM imaging technique. And we see now that we get this updated window of all the different palettes that are the most relevant to what it is that we're doing within the specific technique. So it's a real improvement over older versions of digital micrograph, if you're perhaps familiar with that, where you always had a bunch of windows open and it wasn't quite sure which one you had to use and how to interact with it. The redesign in digital micrograph version 3 makes that much simpler. So because the one view camera is in situ enabled, you'll get this palette at the top that says, do we want to be in normal imaging mode or in situ imaging mode? Right now, we're going to start with normal TM imaging, so I'm leaving it in normal. And then we get down to the one view camera palette. Super easy. You pick essentially, do we want to be in imaging mode or in diffraction mode? That sort of affects, what are the exposure times that are available to you. You pick the imaging binning that you want to use from, the full frame resolution of 4K by 4K down to 512 by 512, and it'll tell you what your resolution is here. And then you have, to start going, we just click view after setting our exposure time. So now you should be able to see an image here. This is an image of the sample that we have here is a barium titanate crystal. So right away, I've reached, I'm at an appropriate magnification, so we can start seeing some lattice in the material. And you might see some shaking, right? I'm talking kind of loud, and I'm standing 1 foot away from the microscope, so that might come out. But it's super easy to start viewing. One of the main things that I would like to emphasize right now that Corey touched on is with the one view, it's one view because you only have to really work at the highest frame rate of 25 frames per second, and you can still be doing 4K by 4K imaging. Whereas, older cameras, you might have to do all sorts of switching back and forth between binning modes to have either, high frame rate with a low sort of pixel resolution image, or vice versa. With the one view, you can essentially always be having this live experience. Like if I move the sample around, you can very quickly see the sample moving, as if you were just looking at the fluorescent screen. So it's a really great way of more easily working with your sample and not having to look back and forth at the fluorescent screen or on the camera or switching binning modes or anything like that, right? If we want to, for example, capture an image now, super simple. You pick our exposure time, however you want to. Say we want a 1 second exposure, and we can click capture. The other thing that Corey touched on was the drift correction capabilities of the camera and how it's a live drift correction, 1-click drift correction. And it's true here. If I want drift correction, I'll click correct drift. Now we see this blue box come up. That's the area indicating that the cross correlation algorithm will use to correct drift. So normally you want to try to put this somewhere on, a notable feature to really help the algorithm out. So something maybe on the corner of this interface here of the vacuum with our sample, or maybe if you have a sharp feature or a precipitate or something, that might be another good region. But for example, we can just click capture now. The data captures. And it opens up here. So now we can see, here's our image. This is a 4K by 4K image. So maybe, I'm not sure how easy it is to see through the the internet that you can already see lattice, but because it's 4K by 4K, you can zoom way in and already start seeing all the details of our lattice structure here within the sample. This is a good time for me to start talking about some of the other features just of the camera and working very simply with images, right? Within Digital Micrograph, we have this option here to essentially set up an autosave feature. If we click Save After Acquire, every image I take will automatically be saved to the data path that I select here in this image name setup window. So there's all sorts of really powerful ways of easily setting up what you want your file name to be. You can name it, you choose any one of these tags if you want. So if I save this image, for example, it'll show you we're using the one view, what KV we're at, what's our specimen, what's our mag. You can do something custom by build using a string, and then you can save it as a digital micrograph format, which I would normally recommend, or you can save it directly as a TIFF or a JPEG or some other kind of image format. So when we come back to our image here, say we don't really like the brightness and contrast levels here, we want to improve something. On this left-hand side here, we also have the image display for everything that we want to do. So as you can tell, I was zooming in. If you look on this image status window here, when I'm moving around, you can see, where I'm at, what pixel I'm at, what, location it is on the image, what's the intensity at that pixel. If I zoom in, you can see how many times I'm zooming in, it's updating here. And then this is our histogram. So if you can either auto survey the image and it sets up the histogram well, or you can adjust the brightness, the contrast, or the gamma, right? So you can move these sliders around. Maybe that looks washed out. We'll just do something, right? And anything you want, you can adjust very easily. And then if you decide you don't like it, if you double click here on each of these icons, it just sets it back to the standard 50, 50, 50, right? The other thing I want to point out too is if you see, I was switching back and forth. So when you collect data in Digital Micrograph, you have what are called workspaces. So the workspace is just this area here that you have to work on everything. This is the standard view workspace where you're, have your live view of your camera image, or say your spectrum if you're doing EELS or EDS or something, and then it automatically starts saving it in a different workspace here. So it helps you automatically start organizing everything much more easily. And when you're really in the weeds of a session and you're collecting great data, sometimes you collect 20 images before you know it, and then organizing everything, it starts to get a bit of a pain, especially if it's all collected on your same view window, right? So I'm just collecting a couple of images here randomly to fill up this workspace to highlight the fact that within the workspace, you collect all these images, great, but now if I have to organize them, that's kind of a pain in the butt. And Gatan has thought of that, and within Digital Micrograph, if we right click on this tab, for example, there's an auto arrange window. So we can choose if we want to auto arrange these windows. It can do an auto layout, or we can set it into a grid with a certain number of grid, or you can cascade all the images across, all sorts of different options. And if you're already using this, for example, the pro tip would be if you do Control L, it automatically lays out all the images for you in a nice way where you can see everything. And that's a nice way of working within the Digital Micrograph workspaces. You can, rename these workspaces, right? So images, if I call it images or something, that tab has a name. It's an easy way to stay organized. And you can always save and then load a workspace for analyzing your data later or sharing it with someone. So I'll show you an example. One of the things, sometimes I'm just sitting here talking, maybe we don't want to irradiate the sample too much. We can just come blank the beam super easily. We don't have to retract the camera or do anything, right? So if I wanted to open a workspace, I can click open. Here's a workspace that I was just testing the other day, right? Here's our BTO sample. Say we were right in the middle of some type of analysis, and we had to stop, right? So here's a workspace that it loads up everything. So if, for example, here is an image that I was taking, we could see this lattice structure. Maybe I want to do a higher magnification image. I think actually maybe this was the same mag. Yeah, it is. You can tell here because we auto named the mag. So this is the same mag actually. But say I had zoomed way in, and I made some type of annotation, right? I had drawn this line profile, and something very standard you might want to do is, if I zoom out, you can see the image of what type of image I had collected. If we zoom in, here it is. And I had collected a line profile, for example, to measure the lattice spacing, right? Something super similar. And because I saved this workspace, everything was saved just as I had left it. Now this workspace is reminding me of a lot of other things I'd like to show. So for example, I'll come back here. If you're familiar working with digital micrograph, older versions like version 1, version 2, at the top here, you always had these tools for doing image annotations or something like that. Now it's not here anymore. We've tried to make it much easier for people to use by simply having it at the axis of a right click. So if I right click on this image, then I get access to these tools like the select tool, the drag tool, which you might have seen me reach for already, where you can just drag the image around here. Say if I'm zooming way in and I actually want to look at here, now I can drag the image over there and see any kind of detail. If we wanted to do a line label, that's something that people often want to do. Say I want to measure this here, I can see, okay, this distance is 4 nanometers, or almost 5 nanometers. It automatically pops up. You could always, change the color. If I right click here, I could change the color of this line if I wanted to. I can change the font and everything about the styling of this line label. Whole lot of options here. Maybe this is really small when I actually zoom out, so I could make it much bigger if I wanted to. I could access this line profile, which I showed you, which if you draw a line, automatically starts giving you this profile, which is representative of, the lattice spacing. But the other thing that I haven't talked about is, say, how easy it is to collect a FFT of your image, and not only an FFT, but a live FFT, right? So we want to collect a really nice sparkly image of this lattice, but of course we got to correct the objective stigmation at some point, right? One of the easiest way of doing it is just doing FFT. So what I'm going to do, for example, is draw a box here, and if I hold Shift, Control, and drag, it makes this box, and then it makes it automatically like a square format. Now if I do Shift, Control, F, it's giving me a Fourier transform of this image. Now we're viewing also at 25 frames per second. This is a live FFT that is also being updated at 25 frames per second. And you see it going in and out essentially as I'm talking, and I kind of leaned on the table a little bit, so it shook it a little bit. But if I'm quiet for 1 second, you'll just see it really nice. Right, super cool. So if I put it, for example, in this amorphous area, now we can see our ring here, and then we could correct the stigmation very easily if we wanted to, right? Because of the high frame rate of the camera, because of the ability to collect, work with this live FFT super, super, super easily. The other thing that I just wanted to mention, obviously, is after, we can collect imaging data really nicely. And for example, maybe the other thing I haven't shown is, if we zoom in more here, we can really show off how nice of a microscope this is. Sorry, the beam shifted off the window. Or off the phosphor screen is what I was trying to say. So I can't zoom in recklessly. But another thing that I just want to really emphasize here is because we have, for example, a 4K by 4K image, and it's a high quality, high sensitivity CMOS sensor, we can see for example, the lattice spacings really far out into the FFT, and we can see that we can zoom super far into the image to still see the lattice of our sample. So collecting a wide field of view is actually oftentimes to your advantage, because you still have enough pixels, as Corey said, to zoom way in and get at the very detailed specific resolution or features with the resolution you need. While this is kind of a uniform sample, so it's not the best thing to show, but if you had you know, a whole bunch of nanoparticles, and they were all different shapes and sizes. Sorry, I touched the holder there. Then, you know, that's a really great advantage of a large format camera like the OneView. So not only can we do imaging with the OneView, we can also do diffraction. You know, here's a diffraction pattern I collected of it, of this sample the other day, just to show, and I'm just showing this so I don't have to switch back and forth between modes and take any more time. But you get really nice diffraction performance out of the camera. Again, you can do all this stuff you might want to do, like measure the spacing between two spots. Same image annotation workflow as with any kind of image. And you'll note that even with the OneView, you can collect diffraction patterns without having to use a beam stop. If you feel like you really need to be able to get at the transmitted beam in your sample. And that's something I think we'll probably talk about a lot more later in the afternoon with the 40 stem aspect of the demo. So these are all just some of the basic imaging things that I wanted to cover. Now say we want to do an in situ experiment, right? I'm on using the samples in a double tilt holder right now. It's not in a in situ double tilt holder or anything. So we're not going to do an in situ experiment today, but I still want to walk you through the workflow of how you would set up an in situ experiment within DM, and then how you might analyze some of the in situ data that you can collect, right? So we're in normal mode here on the top right hand side in the in situ palette. To get to in situ mode, all we have to do is click in situ. Super easy. Now we see that everything that needs to update can update. Pretty much everything is the same here, except now you'll see that we have an option for still capturing a single image, but also recording a video, right? So if we view, here's our sample. I'm not sure what happened there. Oh, we're on a really long frame time here. So we want to be at the highest frame rate, usually, for the highest temporal resolution. So here's our view again, right? And if we wanted to do an in situ experiment, all we really have to do now on top of this is, for example, set our look back time. And Corey explained, you know, look back is, I'll just touch on it again. It's essentially a video buffer of a certain amount of time that you specify that gets saved. So if you set your look back time to 10 seconds and you see your reaction happen, and then you click record, well, the last 10 seconds before you click record is also added onto the start of your recording. So that's how you don't ever miss the start of your reaction. And it's another, you know, there's a question just now about how do we work with a lot of data. And in situ is a great way of generating a lot of data. But even something as simple as look back is one feature that already starts cutting out a lot of the unnecessary data that you have to work with. Because if you don't know when your action is going to start and you have to start recording before anything happens, you might collect minutes or tens of minutes of video data before something interesting does happen. And those 10 minutes of video can easily, you know, depending on the camera and what frame rate you're using, can easily be tens or hundreds of gigabytes in size that you can just start, you know, not worrying about. The other thing is when we're setting up an in situ experiment, again, what we first have to do actually is set up the data path that we want to save the data to. So it's very similar to what I showed earlier. In fact, you still see these options down here. You would just select your data path here. If I click here, you know, you navigate to whatever folder that you want to navigate to, you give it a name, and you can then just start recording your data. Very, very simple to get started on collecting in situ video with the OneView. You know, so really what it does is it's trying to make your experiment much less complex. So if you don't have to worry about the camera and actually we're starting to record the data and acquiring the data, then you can focus on the hard part of like sample prep or setting up the holder or anything else, right? It's one less thing to worry about. So after you save and collect a in situ video, everything gets saved to your folder that you want to show, right? So I'm just going to show you, for example, here. This is what the data format would look like. So each video would saves essentially into folders of hours, then minutes, then seconds, right? And then each individual image frame is saved here in each second, right? So for this video that I'll show you, for example, we can say it's 5 frames per second right now. So what it means is that you can get at an individual frame of your video and do any type of annotation or anything that you might want to do. And more importantly, what that also means is, when we are collecting video data, the video data we're collecting is real data. It's not a screen capture of the DM screen that then is just like really a video and there's nothing you can do with it. It's the full images, the full data that you can do all sorts of data processing, either using the tools built in with Digital Micrograph or Python scripting or anything else. So I just want to, now show you some of the data processing aspects of the OneView camera and in general the in situ ecosystem as we've referred to. So to open it, I'll just click Open In Situ Dataset, and I'll navigate to the file, the in situ dataset that we want to use, and I'll click Select Folder. Sometimes it asks you to enter the frame exposure. I'll just enter that. And it opened here. One nice thing too about Workspace is, say I don't want to, I want to keep this workspace clean. I can actually right-click and move it to a different workspace, Workspace 25. Okay. So this is actually a in situ video. This is the video that you saw in the slides that Corey presented. So we want to do some data analysis of in situ. So what I did is I clicked home on the techniques manager, and so I can navigate now to the in situ techniques pane. And we see the 2 primary tools of in situ data analysis within Digital Micrograph, which are the in situ player here up top and the in situ editor. So, I'm going to blank the beam here. I just remembered. So the player is essentially a way to go through all of the data that you want, right? Here's the play button. We'll start seeing this is being played through, and it's telling you this number here is what frame you're on in the video. This is the timestamp, and then you can do all sorts of things, right? You can pause it and scrub through yourself, and you can see, here the beam moved and it's going in and out. It's moving like crazy. You can do it so that it keeps looping when it hits the end of the video, or it doesn't, based on what you select. You can change the playback speed here. Right now we're playing back at 1 time speed, but we can speed it up to 8 times speed, 16 times speed, and you can see we hit the end, so it's looping again. Or we can slow it down, right? To say there's something here that was happening, we can slow it down really, 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 really slow. And if we look carefully, it's updating frame by frame. So maybe this is actually too slow because we're only 5 frames per second, but and again, because this is the full data, I can always pause it and like zoom way in on some type of feature here, right? Here we can see some type of lattice, and if I wanted to, I could draw like an FFT here and get an FFT out of that one specific region. So once you have your data, you really are not limited at all in what you can do with it. I'm not going to use this now, so I'll just close this and I'll delete this. So say we're done reviewing our data. I'll bring this back to one time, and this is an experiment where we were heating and cooling these nanoparticles, and they were melting and crystallizing, and that's why they're moving around when because it's being heated and cooled. But say this whole part we're just looking at, like the beam gets in the way, and maybe after that, in this case we don't really care about the rest of this video. We only care about this first part where it's sort of something maybe interesting is happening in theory. We can start using the in situ editor tools to work on editing our video. So for example, one of the first things that we can do is crop the image or the video to a smaller region of interest. And the main goal of the Insitu editor is, one, to take your data and turn it into a really nice video that you can put into a PowerPoint or share with someone at a webinar. But the other thing, again, coming back to the data handling, is to take your data, condense it down to the most interesting part that you want to actually look at, and is a smaller data size that you can work with, right? Because again, for example, with the one view, if you collect a 4K by 4K image, each image is 64 megabytes. You're collecting at 25 frames per second. And so if you have a 10-minute video, you can do the math, right? You're adding up gigabytes and gigabytes and gigabytes very much. But I can open up a 500 gigabyte data set with the Insitu editor, edit it down and export it to an MP4 video that's, 100 megabytes or less, depending on how much editing I do. And I can walk through each of the steps now to show you what exactly you can do. So one of the first things you can do is crop it to a smaller region of interest, right? So say we only want to focus on this one big particle. If I, again, draw a click and drag to draw a region of interest here, you see in this dotted line, and then click crop region of interest. Now when we export the data or export the video, we're only going to get this ROI in the video and not all this like unnecessary stuff. And essentially what this is all is unnecessary data for us if we decide that we don't need to always be dragging around, right? And so if we're cutting the number of pixels in image by half, you're cutting the amount of data that you're working with in half. And if we look here at the bottom, you can see, for example, we're at this image size is 1500 by 1700 pixels. So the other thing you can do in terms of reducing the amount of pixels that you have or reducing the video size in a spatial dimension is binning, right? We can work with full resolution, or we can work with a binned image. You can bin 1, 2, 4, 8 times, and you can do this in real time. Essentially, say we want to bin by 2 now. Now here's our image, and not only can we bin by 2, it's happened in real time. So any edits here we make in the Insitu editor, we can then play through and test in the player to make sure that the end result of the video is going to be exactly what we want before we export it, instead of having to export a bunch of different videos until we finally get the one that's just right. So as you see, it was moving around, and the particle here, for example, drifts out of this ROI. That's not good, but we'll talk about the drift correction in just a few minutes. The other thing, for example, is we can do is crop time. So a shorter video is less data also. So say the way we select the area that we want to crop, for example, is using these square brackets. So let's say we're happy with the starting position. So if I click this, we're gonna set frame 0 as the starting point, and now I can start playing, and I can say, okay, we can watch it play through until we get to a point that we want to cut it off, right? And what I normally use as this example, is like here-ish. Oh, the camera is retracting. So that's, maybe I'll just make an aside, right? The one view, as one of the, protective measures just in general, is after a while, if we're not using the camera, it auto retracts. So nothing can happen to it if we've forgotten about it and we're busy analyzing our data and not actually looking at the camera like we just were. Anyway, moving on. So say like here is where like the beam starts coming in, and we don't want to show that part. So at like frame 218, right? So now if I click this right bracket in the crop time, it will only go to frame 218. And in the Insitu player here, everything's been updated. So this blue bar now is the duration of the video that we're actually going to be showing. Here it's moving around, and we can loop it. The next thing you can do is combine frames in your image as you export the video. This also reduces the amount of data you're working with, right? Because if you combine 25 frames into 5 frames, then it's just only 5 images versus 25. It's a 5-time reduction in data. And a lot of times, if you're doing an in situ experiment, we're working with low beam doses, which you want to, have an experiment where you can say that your results were not affected by the electron beam, and that can at times give a noisy video or noisy image, noisy data based on how low dose you're using and what type of camera you're using as well. So, that's another segue into this whole one view versus K3 or CCD versus CMOS versus direct detection kind of conversation that we can talk later on about. So we can count frames. We can add 2 frames up. For example, if I hit 2, and then if I play, you'll see that 2 things happened. One, the image got a little brighter because we have more signal because we're adding frames, but also the frame rate is a little slower because now we've essentially cut our frame rate. And this video actually was already edited down a little bit from the really, really, really raw data. So we were only at 1 frame per second. The other thing you can do, for example, is skip frames. So you can say, I want to add up 5 frames, then skip 5 frames, then add up another 5 frames, then skip another 5 frames. That's kind of like a time lapse kind of feature, which is also already now built into GMS version 3.5, which is actually on this microscope for all the AIF users, as a fun fact. So there's all sorts of things you can do with, choosing what kind of frames and everything you want to do. Because this is already like a somewhat low frame rate video that we're working with, just an example, I'm not going to combine any frames. But now we get to the maybe the most exciting, one of the most powerful features, which is drift correction of this image. So as you can see, the particle is moving all over the place. And we've already cut out a lot of the video where it's drifting even more, but even, say this is the key 10 seconds that we want to show, it's drifting. We still don't want that to happen. So we can either try to drift correct the full frame or drift correct a region of interest within the video. We're already working within an ROI, so I'm just going to switch to ROI. And then all you need to do is usually pick an alignment filter that you want to try to use for the drift correction algorithm. And I'm going to click combined actually, because that's essentially the default one that you want to try first for drift correcting your image. So if we now click drift correction and we start playing through this video, we can see that it's playing through, and then as the particle starts moving out of the field of view, the ROI is going to be following the particle around here, and it's going to be within the ROI, right? Of course, once it gets back to the end of the video, like the particle jumps and then, the algorithm sort of loses it, but all you have to do is move this ROI back here. And then if you're doing really, really advanced stuff, there's also the option for advanced processing. And what this means is like you can add more filter, you can add bandpass filters or any of these default filters, or one of the things that you could also do, but I won't show now, is set up custom filters to do any type of crazy image processing you might want to do, right? Because the in-situ player and in-situ editor is not just for imaging data, right? There's all these other things within the in-situ ecosystem that we've talked about, like 4D STEM or EELS and EDS. You would use these same tools to try to do to edit down your video as you'd use these same tools to edit down all of your in-situ data, regardless of what kind of technique it was coming from. So now that we've set everything up, all we have to do is export now. So at the bottom, we can either export it to video in MP4 format. We can export it to another in-situ data set. Like I showed you, it'll be this sort of like folder file structure, which then, you can continue to edit down or do anything else that you want. Or you can actually just say, I want to take all of the frames in this image and just print them all out, save them into one folder, if that is what you need, maybe for any other further data processing. So all you have to do is click export. I won't actually click this, it will take some time to process all of the data, because what it does essentially is it plays through the video frame by frame, does the processing it needs to, and then saves it. So depending on how crazy we've gotten with our data processing, how big the image and everything is, it might, take a few minutes, which would be sort of boring for all of us to just sit and watch. But I will open, an example of, and you already saw this example, right? Actually, the one thing I will show you, for example, is when you're exporting, you select where you want to export, save everything to, and this is where you have the option to add a scale bar, add a timestamp, with and the color, the location, anything, the font, anything you might want to do here. So this is how you add that information straight into the video, and it's not something you have to then open up in like Adobe Premiere or some other type of video editing software to add later. So if I open that up, here is the unprocessed video. For example, this was in Corey's presentation. Right, nothing's really going on until it starts, kind of going all over the place. Oh, all over, it's kind of drifting and stuff. And then this is what the final result will look like, right? You've already seen this. It was spoiled a little bit, but now we're just focusing on this one particle. We have the timestamp at the bottom, which is maybe sort of obscured right now by the Windows player controls. But we could always export, put on the top right, and we wouldn't have those kinds of problems. So it's a very, very, very powerful, easy to use tool. And again, what it does is it takes hundreds of gigabytes of data that you might have collected, and then takes it and turns it into a much smaller file size of either raw data or MP4 data for you to just put on your laptop and not having to worry about transferring, 500 gigabytes from one computer to the other computer somehow. So I think that's all I really wanted to show for both imaging and in situ. There'll be much more to come with 4D STEM, but if you have any questions right now, I think it's a great time to jump into that, and I'm happy to discuss anything else.
In a picture, so that if we have like different materials, can we like see the difference in the contrast between different materials?
Mm-hmm.
Let's say we're mixing two kind of polymers, and we're trying to see how it gets mixed.
Yeah, we have a question for you, Fernando. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. Do you actually just want to say your question here to the computer so we can hear you? All right, 1 second, Fernando.
Hi, Fernando.
Hello.
Good demo.
Thanks.
So I was thinking of like combining different spectroscopy into a single image, right? So I'm thinking like combining ELS into the image so that we can differentiate between different materials. Let's say if we have the two different kind of polymers interacting with each other, can we do like a bright field image and do some ELS to like find out the difference between those two polymers, or let's say some small molecules and stuff like that?
So do you want to do imaging and EELS at the same time? Is that what your question is?
Yeah, sort of like in real time.
Yes, certainly. I think that, well, EELS is a STEM technique. And so if you want to do TM imaging in EELS, that is possible, but you wouldn't have the type of spatial resolution that you get from being in STEM mode. But certainly you can collect simultaneously EELS data and STEM data, both in a non-in situ and in situ fashion, and have the data played back together. Does that answer your question?
It sounds like yes, sort of. That answered his question. He's nodding his head. So
yeah, I think we're dealing more with the STEM part. So I think it'll come up later. Right?
okay, yeah, and we'll have some time over lunch. So Fernando, can you see the questions that were asked online, or do you need me to post those?
I see one question, so I can read it out. The question is about, what types of cameras are compatible with the latest versions of digital micrograph software? And that is a good question. So there's a lot of people out there who maybe have older equipment and older computers, say running on Windows XP, and they have a camera from 10, 15 years ago, and they're used to using DM1, DM2, and they want to jump to DM3. I would say in particular, the camera question was referring to an Arias camera. So Arias cameras are compatible with DM3. So if you wanted to upgrade to DM3, you could talk to your local salesperson, ask them about that, and then you could essentially do all the imaging control, microscope control, everything I just showed in this demo with the Arias camera. That's not true though for all, what am I trying to say? All of Gatan's hardware through all of time, obviously. Certainly anything within the last several, all the current products we sell are working in DM3. Maybe the previous generation here and there, most of them are working with DM3, but really it's a sort of the Arias camera, yes. I think older cameras, unfortunately, you have to stay in DM2. And that has to do with the fact that they need, 64-bit operating systems, the newer versions of Windows that to support DM3. And so on that sort of individual case-by-case basis, I would say get in contact with us, either Jordan, if he's your salesperson, or someone else, and they should be able to give you more information about what's possible with your system. Oh, I see. Would you mind reading them out to me, actually, Jordan? Because I'm having a hard time seeing all of them.
I actually can't see them on my end.
Okay. Sorry.
I think it was just the question.
Oh, okay. Actually, I got it here. So one of the questions, I switched you to the presenter. Would you mind switching back to me so I can show the screen and try answering some of them?
There you go.
Okay. All right. So one of the questions is, how did I get the smaller red window? Is it a feature for one view only? And I say no. So I think you're referring to this window here. This is just an ROI that I drew. This is something that you can do even in older versions of DM, right? So if I'm viewing, well, everything, so I'll just pretend we're on this image. If you can either do right click and then under this ROI tool, go to rectangle and then draw. But maybe that's too many steps, right? So once you're more familiar with doing everything, you can hold control click, and then you get this ROI box of like any size that you want. But if you do control shift, click drag, then it's always in this square format. So that's how you get the box. And then if I want to do a Fourier transform, I can go to process FFT, but you see here, it also tells you the shortcut. So control F is a 1 FFT, and then Control Shift F is a live FFT. So if we were viewing a live view, this FFT would update in real time, but you can also drag this around. And in fact, if we look really closely, if I drag it around, we'll see, I mean, maybe here, it will update live as well. So that's how we get this sort of feature here on the camera. Let's see what the other question was. What's the beam current used on the demonstration? Not totally sure. I'm trying to see here on the FEI software. I'll have to get back to you on that after this. I'd say, if we're talking maybe about specimen damage or something, I'm using a pretty small spot size or a low numbered spot size, so an intense beam. I don't really worry too much about beam intensity when I'm doing imaging on the camera, other than just trying to maximize it to get a nice image, if the sample can handle that kind of beam intensity. But one of the advantages actually of like a direct detection counting camera like the K3 or like the Stella camera is that it always tells you what dose you have. So the OneView is a scintillator based camera. Unfortunately, it doesn't have that CANF capability. But with that kind of question, it's always telling you, for example, here at the bottom of the screen, to tell you we're working exactly at, say, 5 electrons per angstrom squared per pixel, or per pixel per second or something like that, right? So it's that's one nice thing about the counting cameras, direct detection counting cameras. One of the questions is about labeling the Miller indices on like a diffraction pattern or an FFT. Certainly, you know, within DM, there's not actually any capability for like automatically figuring out what crystal orientation you're looking at based on a structure. It's not like something like EBSD where you can like give it a structure, then it tells you this, we're at this orientation versus that orientation. But certainly one of the things you often do, if, for example, if I open this diffraction pattern, it's a really easy way to you can do a line annotation to go from the center beam to I'll show you here, a center beam to one of these spots, and then using the symmetry and then the spot spacings, you can figure something out. Or there's also built-in tools that have been in digital micrograph for a really, really long time called DiffPack, and that gives you some information about the spacing. Actually, I was playing around with this yesterday. So one thing I didn't show is this output window. If you're doing some type of calculation, a lot of time it outputs it here in the output window, and we didn't use it, so I had dragged it all the way down here. But if we look here, actually, I was playing around with this, some of the DiffPack tools. So you could actually label a bunch of spots. You would first define what the center transmitted spot is, and then when you put the, you put little markers around all the different spots here, and it can calculate, you know, what is the despacing based on where you put it, what is the degrees to spot one, and that helps you get angles and stuff like that for you to then, you know, go back to the basics and figure out what Miller indices you're looking at. Let me go to the next question. How do I get the smaller red window? I think that may have been it for questions that I see here. But if there's any more questions, do you have MSA in the latest GMS version? If you're referring to like all sorts of like analytical fitting, curve fitting, things like that, yeah, in the latest versions, you can do MLLS fitting, you can do NLLS fitting. You just need the licenses for it. Right now in this computer, actually, we don't have the licenses, so I can't show it to you, unfortunately. But right now, because of COVID, what's been going on this whole time is that you can download a special version of Digital Micrograph that has a lot of features that are normally paid, but currently you can get them for free. So if you're interested in like EELS quantification or EDS or stuff like that, I encourage you to go to our website and you'll find that kind of information there to do. And also, the other thing I would just say to anyone interested in any of the analysis, anyone interested in any of the analysis that I showed, if you go to our YouTube page, we've put in a lot of time, especially over like the COVID era, because, you know, sometimes we're all stuck at home, of making a ton of informative videos for everyone to you know, to learn more about the GMS software and how to use our cameras and everything like that. So I think that was all the questions I saw, unless there's any more in person, but I'm happy. Otherwise, maybe it's time for lunch, right?
Yeah, I think that was all the questions we had in person, unless there's anyone else here that has any questions. Okay. I'm seeing some head shakes. So I think with that, we will wrap up the morning session